Hello, good people, and welcome to another episode of The Flow. In order to go with the flow, you have to first understand the flow. So today we have a wonderful guest in the studio with us, Amjad Tadros, and I have to, say again. I think I've mentioned this before that in my office I have a wall of heroes, and I think that after I met Amjad, I need to find a place on the wall for him as a representative of all journalists, because I've had the good fortune of having some really good friends who are in that profession. And I've come to understand both the ethics and the bravery of these guys, especially the war correspondents who go into these highly conflictual areas, risking their lives, wearing a hat, carrying no arms except a pen, and report back to us what's going on so that we're aware of what's happening in the world. And that is a service beyond compare. So, Amjad Tadros, 30 years working at CBS as a producer and mostly reporting back from the Middle East as a fixer. Now, what's a fixer? A fixer is somebody who is local, who knows the area, and when the new guys come, he can show them around and tell them where the stories are. So, having said that, and with great honor and respect, Amjad, welcome to the flow.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, that's true, yes? That war correspondents have one heck of a job?
Totally. I mean, this is not an easy profession to start with because, there are two sides of it. First, what's going to be put on television and what people are going to see or read. But at the same time, we have to be very careful about our security because we always go into places that are not very friendly, let's say. And there's great danger. So, you need to figure out, your logistics, your security situation, places where you're going to, where are we going to sleep, where we're going to report from, our telecommunications network. There's so many elements that get involved in getting a picture from, war zones to viewers back home. It takes a lot of thinking and planning. And usually we don't have time to do it because sometimes events erupt very quickly and you basically think on your feet and act quickly. Fortunately, we have been working in many of those places before, and many of my colleagues and I had some experience on what to do or what not to do most of the time. And we managed to go in and out a few times and do it. Unfortunately, in the process, we lost some of our friends.
Hmm.
I lost about 3 or 4 good friends, during the war in Iraq, and sometimes it's devastating, but we still have to do it and keep going.
One of the things, this may be kind of a very superficial or silly question, but one of the things that always amazes me about the news generally, and I am still a devotee of the evening national news, um, and although I have to say I'm not real excited about the anchor at your old home, the CBS. I watch NBC, but having said that, I'm always amazed at how there is an event in Colorado and the correspondent's there. And the next day, there's an event in Arizona and the correspondent's there. And then they're in France. And it's crazy. How do they get around so fast?
Well, I mean, it's not easy. Usually, because, we follow the news, we need to see what's going on. And, during my days in CBS, had a network of correspondents that were all over the place. And many of them were, stationed in Europe and the Middle East. So it was sometimes easier to get them in place in time. So, but like places like Iraq, it was very difficult to be there because there were no planes to go to Iraq. And the only way to get there was for us to drive from Jordan into Baghdad, and that's a 12-hour journey by car, through the desert. And sometimes it took time. The
And
good news
dangerous. And
and
dangerous.
dangerous. And the good news was is that there was always the 7 hour time difference between the Middle East and the United States. So, but we had like 7 hour lead, so to speak, to get to be there, and that usually saved the day. But
So, I
sometimes
mean, well, I guess what I'm getting at is, what is it like for a correspondent who may be on in Europe and all of a sudden has to go 5 countries over and sitting there having dinner and then he gets a call? How does that work? He gets a call and he says, "Well, we need you, 2,000 miles away tomorrow,"
right.
and he's got to pick everything up and grab his bag and jump on a plane. And how does that
Well,
work?
I mean, it happened to me to many often, and usually, your bag is packed anyway, so you just have to grab it and run. And yeah, it's you get a phone call and you run. We had a big team, so usually somebody else would be worried about getting the flights booked or whatever. And my job was, I was in Amman, Jordan, and Iraq was nearby in a way, 12 hours away. So I was always ready to just move, and it affects your life as well, because for all my career, I never planned ahead. Like, I never planned a holiday 2 weeks in advance, because usually you don't know what's going to happen. I'm always like on a 24-hour notice, so to speak. And so what happens, when the events start to unfold, the correspondent will be on the way. My job would be to get everything ready, so we just, when they land, we just go, or start reporting and get all the network, whatever logistics needed ready. I have been trained by serious professional people of how to report from war zones, basically, and conflict areas. And there are two sides of this reporting. There's the logistic side that people don't see, and then there is the reporting side that goes on television, the editorial side. And so, and the logistics side is very, very important, because without telephone lines, without electricity, without satellite communications, even if you are in the best spot in the world, you're useless. You have to get the story out. And that's basically what I've been trained to do. And I always, been trained by very professional people. And you have to keep your eye on the ball. Forget what's going around you. And the ball is, we have to go there, get a report, report it, and get it into New York in time for the evening news. And that was sometimes very challenging. Luckily, we managed to do it many times. Later in my career, I started working with 60 Minutes, and 60 Minutes is more, because the show is on Sunday, so sometimes you have a week to get it to do it. And usually it takes time for because 60-minute stories are more longer and more detailed, and usually
More
have
investigative.
characters, and we have time to prepare. Sometimes we spend 1 month, 2 months getting a story on television. One of the stories I did took me 4 years to get on television. So, but because we were looking for somebody, and it took us. We were looking all over the world for him, and we found him 4 years later. And but we were on the story all the time, looking. So there's a big difference between the longer format and the evening news format, which is like you have to be on the air now.
So, well, first of all, before we get into some of the heavier things, I want to ask you 2 questions. One is, first, I want you to tell us about your book, why you wrote it. But then after you do that, I have another question for you about journalism. But tell us about the book, The Fixer. It's
Well,
The Fixer, Accidental Journey Through the Middle East.
I spent 33 years working for CBS News in the Middle East. I traveled to a lot of places and have seen a lot of interesting things. Luckily enough, I always had what I call the front row seat to events. I was in Iraq during the many of the wars before. I was there in the 2003 war, when the U.S. Army rolled into Baghdad. I was in Tahrir Square during the revolution. I was in the Gulf states. I was in Libya just before Gaddafi was overthrown. I covered the Syrian revolution. And every time I used to go back home, and I would sit with my friends and tell them where I've been. And everybody was telling me, well, you cannot keep those stories to yourself. You have to write them down. And it took a while. And so at some point, I sat there and I started writing. And I had the help from a young American guy who was an Amman, who was interested in the Middle East and journalism. And he told me, I would help you to do it. So I started typing, on Google Documents at that time, and he was reading behind after me and adding questions and so on. And with time, the book started to take shape, and it was built. It's like building a puzzle, basically. And it wasn't easy because to write a book like this, you have to be very accurate with names and with the dates and with events and who said what when, and those things. It's not like writing fiction. You cannot make it up, and people are going to read it, and that's you have to be credible. So I did that, and it took a while, and then at some point I got fed up, and then I did it. But at the end, what drove me to do it was when I left CBS 2.5 years ago. I could see the onslaught in the U.S. media and all the accusations that was leveled against us of being, fake news and the legacy media and so on. And I thought it was really, really unfair for me and for all my colleagues who really went out of our way and we went to really difficult places for one mission, which was to find the truth and report it. So, and I wanted to show in the book why we have done it and how we did it and all the best intentions we had, to report the truth, basically, which was our main mission. And so this is
So let me
one
let
of
me
the
just
motives.
let me just see if I followed you there. The driving purpose and mission in your heart really was to counter this narrative of fake news that's out there, uh, to help people to really understand through the stories, through the logistics, through the difficulties, through what it takes to do this. You really want people to understand that the function of the journalist is to search out the truth and report it.
Absolutely. And I mean, many people who read the book after I wrote it, called me and said, like, oh, this is not what we think happened. I said, exactly, because sometimes the narrative is not, the public narrative is not exactly what happened. And in some cases, I wanted to put the record straight. And so that was another reason I wrote the book. I mean, I'm not an angel or a preacher or anything. Also, I wrote it because, I wanted to document all those stories so people in the future would understand how news is made. And the way I did it, I hoping that journalism students and people who wanted to know how the Middle East functions would read it and understand why these things happen. In one of
Hmm.
the chapters I wrote in the book was called The Bodyguard, and it was a story of a young man I met by accident in Yemen who turned out to be Osama bin Laden's bodyguard. I found him by mistake. Took me a while to convince him to sit in front of the camera, and we did a story about him. And it's the most fascinating story. And about this young man, how he got involved with Al Qaeda and how he ended up in Afghanistan and how he got away with it at the end. And many people accused us at that point of putting a face to a terrorist, basically, and that we're sympathetic. We're not sympathetic, to these things, but we try to explain rather than justify, like how this guy ended up to be who he is. In fact, one of the things he told me, and it's in the book, that when he was taken into custody in Yemen, he was interrogated by an FBI officer who came from New York to talk to him, and he was the one who actually pointed to the pictures of the 9/11 hijackers because he met them before, but he didn't know why they were there. But he was the first lead that the FBI got to identify the 9/11 hijackers, hours after the incident. And we are not trying to justify, but we're trying to explain what happened in the hope that people, when they read these things, we can find the root causes of what makes people doing the things they did, so that they can prevent it in the future. It's not because we wanted to justify his actions; we want to explain them so people can learn why some young man becomes a suicide bomber. Like if you talk, in one of the stories I investigated was the 9/11 hijackers themselves, where they came from. Okay, somebody like Muhammad Atta, the Egyptian who flew one of the airplanes into the World Trade Center. Why did he do it? In the hope that in the future we can stop these events and go after the root causes. If you look at Iraq, for example, why did Iraq ended up the way it did? Why did Saddam Hussein invade Kuwait in 1990? What happened in 2003? And that was very, very important because in 2003, there were a lot of signs that the war was coming. Saddam knew that the war was coming, and all the allegations that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which was the pretext that the Americans used to launch the war against Iraq. In fact, unlike what was being said, Saddam Hussein did not want the war. He did not want the 2003 war because he knew what was going to happen, and they tried in a lots of ways to stop it. And in fact, 60 Minutes at that time, we did many stories in Iraq to show what was really going on and how Iraq was trying to avoid, the war. Although, in public, Saddam was always defiant and he said, we're going to fight, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, they were terrified and they really wanted to stop it. Unfortunately, this did not happen because the forces that were pro-war, did not listen to what was going on. And they relied at that time on the testimony of one Iraqi defector who went to Germany and he told German intelligence that Saddam Hussein had a biological factory in the south of Baghdad. And he provided the Americans with a story that was kind of credible. Okay, except they never met him, believe it or not. This Iraqi defector, he was given the code name Curveball, was never interviewed by the Americans before the war. They went to war on his testimony without talking to him. It was all based on second-hand reporting from German intelligence, which is, if you look at the story, it's absolutely horrific. Like, how do you do this without even talking to the guy? And they talked to him after the war. What was so sad, and he told me that himself, after he gave all this information, which he made up, but it was, kind of credible. The Americans, they wanted him to come to Washington and be there during the State of the Union address when President Bush gave it to Congress in January 2003. Mm-hmm. He refused. He didn't go because he knew he was telling a lie. And so he didn't go. And so the Americans were terrified at that time that he would go on television as the war was approaching and tell the world about his real story. So they told German intelligence to hide him. So what they did, they took him with his family and kids and put him in some sort of a resort in Germany somewhere that had no television. So when the war happened, he didn't even know. And the only way he knew was after, he was taking his kids out for a walk in the town center, and he saw on the television screens in the town center that the war that he was partly causing started. Can you imagine? And
what a surprise.
So I wrote all of these things. I wanted people to know, like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah. I what you're saying touches me because two things. One is when I teach on campus, I teach in my law classes, I continue to emphasize to my students that when you start a business, you have to keep minutes of your meetings because, at least I tell them at least in business with your minutes, if you don't record it, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. Yes. It's lost. So you have to document it. And then the other thing is that I just finished writing a novel, which is I guess you'd call it historical fiction. It's a fictionalized story of my father's life, who was born in Hungary and immigrated through Ellis Island, and it's the whole immigrant story. And as I am writing my query letters to try to get an agent, I say in that I really am the only one who could write this story and if I don't write it, it will be lost. It'll be lost forever. And the stories that you have in your book, I mean, if you did not document them, if you did not write them, it would be as if they never happened because it would be lost. All of your
and now
wisdom, all of your experience, all of your heartbreak, all of the devastating things, and all of the joys and wonders and lucky events that occurred, all of that would just be lost if you didn't write it.
and now actually in the age of AI, what's going on is that all these AI tools that we use now,
Hmm.
they basically read everything, and the information they get back to you is based on whatever was published. So I always tell my Arab friends, if we do not write our own history ourselves, people are going to write it for us, and then we are
Hmm.
not going to like what they write. And if we write more, those AI agents are going to use whatever we write as a reference. In fact, now if you go into on Claude or on OpenAI on ChatGPT and ask questions that are related to my book, it will use my book as a reference, and whatever was mentioned there, it will be as used in the
Hmm.
analysis. So it is important for people, to document these things uh, for future generations, and
Yeah.
hoping that people would read and they will not commit the same mistakes that were done before.
Yeah, and what you're saying has application not only in the macro world of the world, but also in our individual lives. There are some services out there. I think they're interesting where they suggest to you write your life story, and we will send you a prompt every week and a question to answer. What was your favorite pet? Who was your high school teachers? Things like that, to prompt you to write, your life story. Because, truthfully, if you don't document it, I remember when my dad died. It was funny. My mom was well, she was Depression era, and she was very thrifty, let's say. And
Oh,
when my dad died, they she refused to pay to rent a coffin before he was cremated. So they just put him out on a slab. Just put him on a slab of concrete. And I remember sitting there looking at him, and he was 97 years old. And I thought, poof, poof. He died, and everything, all the stories, everything that was his life is gone,
well, yeah,
except for what he left.
yeah,
So
memory.
the other question I wanted to ask you is this. Let's imagine that you have been asked right across the street where I teach, Zelon University. We have a magnificent communication school and a great journalism major. So let's say that you have been asked to come and speak to the freshman class, the starry eyed new students, who think, maybe I want to get into journalism. Let me see what it's like. And you come to speak to them about why should you be a journalist? Why does it matter? Why did I become a journalist? And what does it mean to be a journalist? What would you say to them?
Well, I became a journalist by accident. That's why. So it's one accidental journey, and but I can tell people, I mean, journalism is. I was lucky to be into that profession, because your curiosity, sometimes something happens somewhere, you just want to be there and see it for yourself, and nothing in the world comes close to that. Like, I was in Tahrir Square in 2001 when the revolution happened, and the vibes and the feelings were just you know no Hollywood movie can give you the same thrill, because you
Mm.
see it yourself firsthand. So it is a very, very interesting profession. Unfortunately, now the whole industry is going through financial issues because of the spread of the social media and the drop in the advertising revenue for most of the networks. And now, the political attacks that are coming from different sides to try to control the messaging. Okay, and that is putting so much pressure on journalists now to be fair and accurate. So because people in most cases, it's much easier to put news that the people like to hear rather than the news that people should hear. Okay,
Mhm.
and that's a very, very delicate difference. And okay, and who's going to decide which is what is news for a start, and what we should report and what we shouldn't report. And that's a very I mean, these are questions that journalists ask themselves every day. But at the end of the day, it is a very rewarding profession. People, should do it, but they should do it out of conviction as well, because journalism has a mission, which is we have to go out, find the truth, and report it, no matter what, even if you don't like the what you are reporting, and that's very, very hard to do sometimes. Now, with time, the methods have changed, from television to satellite television to cable television to the internet now to TikTok and all these things that we see. So the methods have changed, but the mission did not change. It's one mission: find the truth and report it. Because if you don't do that, you're going to lose in the end. Because the truth will come out sooner or later, and you don't want to be caught, in the wrong side of history. So you have to always, remember that it is important, because at the end of the day, you know, your credibility is your only asset. And when I wrote the book, for example, I was very careful, because I live in the Middle East, and there are a lot of Middle East is a very complicated region. And for example, in the book, I wrote 3 chapters about Saudi Arabia, and how what happened to Saudi Arabia and the transformation that happened. And at the beginning, it started with 9/11 and all these accusations that were leveled against the Saudis of being part of the 9/11 plot and so on. And then later, when Mohammed bin Salman took over, and it's a very, very tricky subject to write, especially that I live in the region and I go to Saudi Arabia, and you don't want to be caught, by some angry people to tell you lied. So I wrote it, and then when I finished, a friend of mine who's Saudi called me. He's like, "Hey, Amjad, where is the book? I want to read it." And I was terrified to send it to him. And then he came to Amman to visit me, and I said, "Listen, here's the draft. You read it, and you tell me before you talk about it to your colleagues, because I'm not sure they're going to like it." And so he took it, and guess what? 2 weeks later, he called me and he said, "This is great." Because what I did, I just basically wrote what I saw, and nobody can dispute that. I did not take sides. I did not praise or condemn anybody, and I just said what happened. And it's for the audience to decide, on which side of history they want to stand. And at the end of the day, he loved the book to the point that he did a one-page feature in his newspaper in Saudi Arabia about my book, because it was just fair, and I did not try. I had no intention to please anybody or accuse anybody of anything. It's not my job. My job is just to report the news. We are storytellers. We are not opinion makers, and that's a
Yeah, yeah.
very, very important.
Back in the day, there was a TV show called Dragnet, and there it was a detective and his sidekick detective, uh, Jack Webb was the character's name, and he would it was very stilted. The vibe of the show was very stilted. He was a man of very few words, but he would be interviewing somebody, and the person would start to go off on opinion, and his famous line was always, "The facts, ma'am, just the facts."
Yes, exactly.
The
And that's
facts,
what
ma'am.
matters at the end of the day. Honestly, I mean, the worst story you can do in your life is a story you want to do to prove a point,
Mhm.
because it's not our job. Our job is just to report what we see with all honesty and transparency.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the current situation with this administration, the statements being made. It's all fake news. The news is the enemy of the people. The media is the enemy of the people. Um, and what's happening with CBS and the kind of movements that are happening within journalism that may not be particularly helpful. Can you speak to that? How you see all that?
Well, I'll try to speak to that without getting into trouble with anybody. Two and a half years ago, I was offered an early retirement package from CBS News, and I took it for a lot of reasons. A, because I was, getting, kind of old to go out on the field and, run around and carry camera and the tripod and so on. But also, I could see the pressure that we are going under by the management, because at that time, CBS News was sold to Paramount and to somebody else first, and then they sold to Paramount, and that was sold to somebody else. All these decisions that are made way over our heads that we don't even know. We read about them in the news, but we could see on the ground that their tolerance has been reduced towards us as the foot soldiers. And they started by my boss lost his job, and then it was me, and it was somebody else, and we could see that it was a pattern. And I could not see myself working for those people, because the last thing I wanted to do in my job is being told what to do and what not to do, because we are journalists. We are not government spokespeople, and we could see the pattern happening. Unfortunately, the pattern has continued in a very huge way. I mean, 2 weeks last week, I think it was, the CBS News London bureau chief was fired because she was accused by some cameraman or something that she is a Hamas supporter. I mean, come on. And can you believe this? And I know the woman. She's a very professional journalist, and she was doing her job. So now when this is done, everybody else in the business, because at the end of the day, we have jobs and we need income. When you see that, people will start to think twice before they go out of their way and do something more courageous to report anything. And that just creates so much pressure. I look at my colleagues who's still there, and I always tell them, you are like the band on the Titanic. You're still playing the music, but you know what's going on. And so I was, in a way, lucky that I left just in time before I was on the first lifeboats out, and so I look at it, and it's so sad. But what's even sadder for everybody else, not just for us as journalists, is without free media, societies are not going to progress. In my book, I wrote a whole chapter about how Saddam Hussein controlled the media in Iraq in the 1990s, and how they controlled every word that appeared on television and on the newspaper. And in fact, Xerox machines in Iraq needed to be licensed. You had to have a license to own a Xerox machine. Imagine. There were no satellite television. There were no foreign newspapers. There was no foreign books. Everything had to come from one source with one message. And look what happened to the regime at the end of the day. They could not survive. Because if you don't have free media, you are depriving the people from ways to express their point of view, and depriving yourself from positive feedback that might come to know what the problems happening in the country, to avoid them for your own sake. Even if you are a dictator, you still need free media to tell you what is going on. Okay, otherwise you're going to be deceiving yourself and deceiving everybody around you. And this example happened.
Whoa. That's a fascinating point. I don't want to pass over that. What I just heard you say was that even in an authoritarian regime, a free media is helpful. Otherwise, what happens is that the government starts to really become siloed, becomes encapsulated with its own news, and it starts to make decisions that eventually are not going to be helpful because it's not operating on accurate information. And so it's kind of like a whiplash. They think that they're controlling the media for the benefit of keeping the people ignorant, but at the same time, they're keeping themselves ignorant. And so they can't really respond to crises which eventually will cause their own downfall.
Yeah.
Is that accurate? Is that
absolutely? And also, the people themselves are going to stop believing, the news. Like in the Middle East, we got to a point that people do not trust official news, to the point that they don't believe the weather forecast. Forget politics. you know. So
So
they hear
that let's go into that what you just said, that in the Middle East people don't believe the news, so they stop listening to it. Now, there has been a concerted effort on the part of the administration to put out this narrative of fake news and the like, and which I find, kind of interesting, because those people that are screaming fake news, they watch their own preferred fake news
yeah,
stations because it's feeding them what they want to hear.
exactly.
Um, and so it's fake news if I don't like it, but it's true if I do like it.
Exactly.
But let's not get into that. What I wanted to ask is, in America, I believe that there still are ethical, legitimate, accurate news agencies.
So totally.
I will admit completely that many news providers, even if they're reporting accurate, fair, and true news, might be biased in choosing what they're going to cover because they are either a little left leaning or a little right leaning, and they that means that emotionally they feel that this story is more important than that story, and you have to make those choices in journalism. What goes above the fold, what goes above the fold, what goes on page
Totally.
12, what do you lead with? These are all logistical questions that journalists have to answer. So there may be some bias there, but in terms of the accuracy of the reporting, I believe that there still is a viable and strong media in America. And I hate to see people throw out the baby with the bathwater, in that they all now group everything. They're not satisfied that this is accurate. You can't trust that, so I'm not going to trust anything. And it's kind of a way of just divorcing yourself from being engaged in life.
Yeah.
So, what advice do you have for a listener right now in how do you ferret out a diet of news that you feel you can trust and rely on? How do you find that, or how do you develop trust?
Well, first of all, you have to educate yourself. You know,
You have to
so
what?
you have to look at you have to look at the byline, the dateline, who's reporting, from where. You have to look at different news organizations. I mean, I still maintain, like, a news organization like Reuters and AP have very, very high standards of reporting. I mean, they are, I'm not saying everything they report 100% is true, but the vast majority of what they
And if
report
it's
is,
not true, they correct it.
and if not true, and they admit it. If you look at, for example, at 60 Minutes, in the whole 55 years history of 60 Minutes, they made few mistakes, and what happened? They admitted it. If you remember, Memogate, in the 60 Minutes ran a story about President Bush Vietnam records. Few of my friends lost their jobs because the story was not true, and CBS, admitted that. If you look at the New York Times, New York Times is a very important news organization that's been there for years. And, this current administration is a side note for them. It's not the whole history of America. So, but if you look at,
I love that. This administration is just a side note for them. They've been around so long.
for
They've been through so
in
many.
the 200-year history of American politics, 4 years of administration is just it's a side note, of course. So those people, if you look at, but again, the way that, to go back to CBS News, like, okay, the CBS News, now it was controlled. They brought their own people and their own boss and so on. Look what happened at the ratings. They tanked because people stopped watching. You know, it's, so in a way, it's self-defeating. Okay. So, I mean, look at their recent polls, ratings. They're nothing now. Nobody's watching the news, because, they know what they are after now. And so it's self-defeating. What keeps the journalism going is to have free media, multiple free media organizations that are in competition, and that will keep things together. Like, I know, when I used to go to CBS News in New York, when the evening news comes out, all the editors in chiefs of the news, they'll have three screens, one on CBS, one on ABC, or one on NBC. And but they will not be looking at their own screen. They'll be looking at the other two screens to see what the others are reporting, to see if they missed a story that they should have reported. This is what keeps the ball rolling. competition, free media. Don't get administration should not get involved, and that will serve everybody's purpose. It will serve the purpose of the society for a start, the administration, and the progress of society. You cannot hide the truth for you can do it. You can fool the people half the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time, and that's exactly what they should be looking after.
Okay, Amjad, I have I don't know if you can address this, but I have to say that it is a very, very deep concern of mine, and I just came off a conversation with several of my very good friends, and we're all sharing this very, very deep concern. And I wonder if there are any experiences that you had from the Middle East or any historical information or anything within, what you've seen and reported on that can enlighten our concern. And let me tell you what that is. We see an administration that is clearly committing crimes. This is what this and this is our opinion and our conversation, our concern. I'm just going to present it and then ask you if you, how again if there's any wisdom that you can place on it. And when I say crimes like that, I would cite, for example, it is a crime to have insider trading, and we see big stock purchases and big investments in things 2 or 3 days before a political announcement is made that benefits that investment. We see President Trump himself trading stock. No president has ever traded stock by making $600,000 million investments in companies that are going to be benefited by a policy decision that he's going to announce 2 or 3 days later. Now, that's clearly insider trading. Of course, he is exempt from any criminal prosecution thanks to the decision by the Supreme Court. But where I'm going with this is we see many, many things that are investigatable, that are suspicious, that would bring about a congressional investigation and the like. And it is almost as if they are operating with a feeling of, well, it's okay because we're not going to lose power. If we lose power and the other side comes into power, we're going to be in a lot of trouble, and we're just not going to lose power. And where I'm going with that is we're very deeply concerned about the midterm elections, and that there may be some movement to create some chaos around that. And that's what our concern is. And I wonder if there's anything that you've seen in the Middle East that mirrors that mirrors that idea of suppressing an election in order to stay in power. Have you seen anything that we could that's similar, or do you have any wisdom? It's
Well, first of all, our job as journalists is not to be judges and decide who is doing, who's a criminal and who's not. There are courts and there is a Congress and so on. That's not, our job is basically to report what we have seen. Okay, and let somebody else make those decisions. That's not us. But if you look at the Middle East, for example, everybody knows most of elections in the Middle East are farce. I was in Iraq, in 1995 or 6, where Saddam Hussein stood for re-election, and he won by 99.96%. Only like 5 people said no or something. And okay, it's not for me to decide if the election was fair, or where people were voting, in their right conscience. But at the same time, look what happened later. It doesn't work. It does not work. You can suppress the elections. You can do ABC. But at the end of the day, that truth will come out, and people will make out their, and they will, next year, the year after, in 10 years' time, there will be repercussions. Our job is we are not the judges. We are just the witnesses, and we can just report it and let other people do it. And we have to keep at it. We should, if you see something wrong, you say, I saw this, that, and the other, and let others report it. So the problem with journalists now, okay, and usually most of the time we put ourselves on a higher pedestal and give ourselves more like moral authority than the others, and that's not right. Journalists sometimes are as guilty as anybody else of being biased and so on. So, but if you have a free media, you have competition, and people would report those stories, and somebody else will take those stories and make decisions about it. And I think that I'm hopeful, honestly, that it will survive. The media at the end will survive. What we are seeing now is a transient phase. At the end of the day, competition will make things better.
Hmm. Yeah, I think
I'm
Gandhi.
still hopeful.
Yeah, no, Gandhi, I think put it succinctly in a quote that goes something like, "If you think about it, no dictator has ever survived, ever. Never in history have they ever survived,
No, I mean,
ever."
look at South America, for example. They had all these military regimes running the show. Look what happened to them. Look at Saddam Hussein. Look at President Assad in Syria. You know, it doesn't work, unfortunately. Sometimes I tell people I wish we can find, the so-called benevolent dictator who would run the show. And it's at the end of the day, people power, will prevail,
Hmm.
and no matter what, we were going to go into phases, maybe ups and downs, and I think the media should be always there to report it.
Amjad, I think that we've covered the subject very well. I purchased your book and I'm reading it, and I'm fascinated by it. Recommend it to all the listeners. It's called "The Fixer: A Journalist's Accidental Journey Through the Middle East," and
And if
it's
people want
got
to read it,
great stories. And if you want to understand the dynamics of what's happening over there, um, and and learn about that, I highly recommend it. And any closing thoughts?
well, again, the reason I wrote the book is just I want people to know what happened so that they learn from it. It's basically it's a series of stories and anecdotes that I have seen, and the book is a bit long, but the other stories are short, and you can read half of it and still enjoy it. And it has a very, very good index at the end. It indexes all the events and timelines and so on. I worked really hard to make the index, and people should. I mean, if you're interested, they should read it. They can go on my website amjadtadros.com. There is a lot of descriptions about the book and about all the different chapters. There are all extra material there and some podcasts and so on. But they should read the book itself and hopefully enjoy it and learn something.
Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your experience, and sharing it with us.
Thank you for having me.
Be well.
You
And
too.
you know what I love to say to folks? Be happy.
Yes, important.